Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
As the openly Marxist Black Lives Matter continues to push the envelope in city after city, undergirded by Democrat mayors and governors who've refused to stop weeks on end of violence, destruction, and outright insurrection in Portland, Seattle, and several other cities, there exists a gulf as wide as an ocean between what young people in particular believe about Marxism, if they've even bothered to consider it, and the reality on the ground. A brief look at history demonstrates the unrelenting misery and death spiral of every single nation that's been overtaken by this communist philosophy over the last 103 years since the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. The world has recoiled in horror upon learning about the death march of totalitarians like Mao Zedong in China, Pol Pot in Cambodia, Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Anyone with even a shred of intellectual honesty can reach only one conclusion. Marxism, communism, has been a plague on the planet Earth far worse than any pandemic or even a nuclear bomb. But one of the most vivid, broad-ranging, and overlooked examples is an entire continent dominated by socialism. That would be Africa, where socialism replaced European colonialism steadily over the last 75 years or so. What can we learn from Africa about socialism? A lot, according to Andrew Moran, author of an article on LibertyNation.com entitled "Socialism, Not Colonialism, Keeps Africa in Perpetual Poverty." And Andrew joins us now. Hello, Andrew.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure. Let me ask you a question that you yourself pose in the first paragraph of your article. Following decades of destitution, deprivation, and despair, has Africa learned from socialism's failure?
Well, I'll quote the great economist Milton Friedman, who said, "Governments never learn, only people do." I think a lot of Africans, I don't have the polling data to back this up, maybe Pew has done this, but I think a lot of Africans understand the failure of their governments and their corruption and ineptitude and generations of poverty. A lot of Africans are trying to be self-reliant, and you see the growing entrepreneurial spirit occurring across the continent. They're trying to serve their communities with goods and services using access to technology, mobile devices, mobile internet, things like that. But the problem, unfortunately, is that the government clamps down on these successes, and they always reinforce their iron fist. And they get shakedowns, or they impose government restrictions. They demand bribes. If you look at Zimbabwe right now, people they're having again food shortages and blackouts, and all this is 2 years after Mugabe conceded power. And so people are forced to sell basic necessities in the back of their cars at nighttime in the middle of nowhere out of fear of retribution from the state, especially if you're a white person. So no, I don't think African politicians have learned from socialism's failure. I think in an attempt to misdirect the public, they'll blame the white people for their problems, which is currently what's going on in South Africa right now. And the strategy appears to be working so far. So I guess in order for these dictators to stay in power, they'll just blame the white minority in their countries to say, it's not our fault we're suffering, it's the white man's fault.
Well, on that note, critics will say the continent of Africa was decimated and demoralized by the colonial rule of European powers, England, France, Germany, others. And that's the real cause of Africa's seemingly unending despair. Tell us what's wrong with that argument.
Well, I think history is complicated. It's not as black and white as saying that British colonialism of Africa was horrific. I think everyone can agree that colonization is not a desirable system. You don't want an invading force to occupy your land. But that said, British colonists, they helped develop many of these places in sub-Saharan Africa. The British introduced a lot of positive things, sanitation, primary healthcare, business development, public transportation, a lot of infrastructure. So they introduced a lot of things that few Africans had access to. Research has found that the average African today is poorer than at the height of colonialism. The building blocks of capitalism were also integral to African development of that period, from respecting private property rights to maintaining contractual relationships. There's actually the former president of Sierra Leone met with a visiting British politician, and there were these bunch of reporters surrounding their meeting. and he asked if Sierra Leone can again become a part of the British Empire. So that's just so show that many people, even within Africa, think that they were better off being under being a subject to the Great Britain than being independent in dealing with these horrific dictators. Before colonialism, many of the parts of the continent were difficult to navigate. You had a lot of tribal warfare and slavery. The conditions were not great. It wasn't until British colonies introduced advanced technologies that these places could utilize their vast amount of untapped potential, whether it's from commodities or farmland. So during the days, let's say Rhodesia, during the British colony, Zimbabwe was the breadbasket of Africa. It provided the continent and the rest of the world with a lot of agricultural goods, wheat, grain, all that stuff. Today, it imports nearly all of its food. For the remainder of what it produces, it has to, during when Mugabe was president, he imposed legislation that would force white-owned farms to transport or to transfer ownership to black people. The problem with that policy is that when the black people when a lot of these blacks took control of the white land, they didn't know what they were doing. They were inexperienced. They didn't know how to grow, how to cultivate land, all that stuff. So another issue too is that when they didn't know what they were doing, they gave up the land. They just abandoned it. So we had this good land with all this with great potential. Now nobody's running it. Therefore, the country is running out of food, and they have to turn to outside sources for that. Everywhere you go across Africa since the post-colonial era, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, South Sudan, they adopt a lot of these villagization policies, and they're out of food. Their remedies, and what I find funny too is that when they adopt these socialist policies, it was out of the name of remedying the food crisis. Now there were food problems, but what happened? They exacerbated the problem. They made it a whole lot worse.
Well, now some of these African countries, are not only fertile, but they're rich in natural resources like oil and gold, and yet they're still impoverished. I'll ask the same thing I have about oil-rich Venezuela, which has become a frightening hellhole. How is it possible for countries like this to have starving people and runaway hyperinflation when they have so many commodities that are valuable and easily sold to the rest of the world?
Well, of course. I mean, the answer to that question is socialism. Sure, fine. The British don't occupy Africa anymore, and Venezuela has been independent for, I think, a century. Now, when it comes to Venezuela, the situation, I think, is a bit more complicated. But I think the overall issue with the oil situation in Caracas is price controls and a shortage of materials and equipment to extract and ship the oil. Now, when before the sector was nationalized by the government, they were able to export huge amounts of oil. Everything became nationalized under Maduro. Now, what happened there? When everything was nationalized under Maduro and the borders were, it was hard to deal with Venezuela because of the sanctions. They didn't have access to tools. They didn't have access to a lot of the goods and services you needed to take that oil out. So, but by the end of it all, when government's running the oil, they didn't know what they didn't know what they were doing. Anytime the government has attempted to resolve any issue or benefit from something, they fail.
Now, you write, the socialists claim you can't have capitalism without racism, and that is what's kept socialism largely ever present throughout most of Africa. Explain that, if you would, that you can't have capitalism without racism.
Yeah, well, I've seen this a long time, and when I was covering the Occupy Wall Street protests years ago, they had the same kind of idea. Capitalism is racist, and capitalism is exploitative, and all that hot garbage. But this explains why they don't want to engage in debate or discussion, because they know that if these platitudes were even just dissected for a few moments, everything would fall apart. They know that their concepts don't amount much to anything. Capitalism only cares about one color, green. But if capitalism were racist, as I wrote in my article, how come Nigerians who come to the United States have an median income higher than the national average in the United States? Why do Asians flourish in every country that they migrate to in any market-oriented economy? So it doesn't make sense when they say that capitalism is a racist institution, because so many ethnicities, so many minorities have benefited from the system. And one thing I detest is when I read that socialism and Africa go hand in hand because of this whole brothers keeper idea. it's ridiculous, because then how come they're not benefiting? How come they're not being successful? How come when Africans move to the United States, Canada, Europe, they flourish? So socialism is not compatible with African culture whatsoever, from what I've studied.
Well,
Maybe need a Black Lives Matter person to prove me wrong.
well, as always, you've taken us to school, Andrew, and we thank you for that. Information is key, and everybody needs to know what Marxism, socialism is really about. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.